Now let's talk about the studies of polarized training.
Right. All right. Let's dive in. I hope you all brought a snorkel. All right. So one of the most commonly cited studies demonstrating the effectiveness of polarized training is probably the Neal et al. Study from 2013. This is also one of the few intervention studies that examines the effectiveness of specific training intensity distributions, polarized being one of them, in cycling specifically. So we'll spend a little bit more time on this one because of that. So the Neal et al. Paper, this is published in 2013. The title of the paper is 6 Weeks of Polarized Training Intensity Distribution Leads to a Greater Physiological and Performance Adaptations Than a Threshold Model in Trained Cyclists. So again,
go ahead.
Dive in.
Okay, so what they're trying to figure out here is based a threshold model where you do a bunch of Z2 work and no Z3 work. Does that improve performance? Or certain, we'll get into it, ways to measure how fit you are relative to following a polarized model. Now, the questions that we have that we're going to jump into are the importance of Z3, the possible effects of fatigue on testing outcomes, and the order of these blocks of the intensity. And that might sound a little esoteric right now when I say it, but we're going to go back and hit these as we go through the study. But it's just try to remember those as we go through it.
Exactly. Okay, so let's dive in. On this study, again, authors have to kind of choose, they have to choose the subjects that they're going to use for the study. So in this case, they chose trained male cyclists, and they chose to define trained as cyclists who have been training for at least 4 years or more, 5 to 10 hours a week, and all of their subjects had peak power output of about 4.7 plus or minus 0.5 watts per kg. So in that range, that's going from about 4.2 to or a little over 5 watts per kg at peak power output. Peak power output is somewhere around your VO2 max power, roughly. So what this does is it puts these cyclists they're going to range between the low and the high end of roughly a Cat 3 fitness. And they had 12 subjects for this study. And this is a really cool experimental design. I love this design. So it's a randomized crossover study. And what that means is they randomly chose subjects. They divided them into 2 groups. So because they had an N of 12, they divided them into 2 groups of 6 each. And the treatment went like this. Each group did 6 weeks, 1 of polarized, 1 of threshold, and then they tested. So they did baseline test, 6 weeks in one of those 2 training intensity distributions, and then they tested. Then they did 4 weeks of detraining where they did nothing over LT1 and they only rode 3 to 5 hours a week. After that, they did another baseline test and then they did 6 more weeks. This time, if they had done polarized the first time around, they did threshold. And if they'd done threshold the first time around, they did polarized. So that's what they mean by crossover study. And that kind of helps even out some of the individual variation that we see in this. And the way that they did this during those 6 weeks of polarized versus threshold, the polarized prescription training was fixed at 80% in that low intensity zone 1, 0% in that middle zone between LT1 and LT2, and 20% in that high intensity zone 3. The way they did the high intensity work was they did 6 by 4 minutes on and 2 minutes off at about 105 to 110% of LT2 or FTP. Versus the threshold group. The threshold group divided their training up into about 57% low intensity zone, 43% in that middle zone between LT1 and LT2, and 0% in that high intensity zone 3. And the way they did their intervals was a 1 by 60 minute effort, continuous, at halfway between LT1 and LT2. And again, all of these percentages are based on time in zone. What they measured was,
Yeah, so to give context, halfway between LT1 and LT2 is probably somewhere around sweet spot. So in this one, in their method, they were given 60 minutes straight of a sweet spot or a little bit low, somewhere close to that. It doesn't directly relate, and we don't really know what they did exactly, but that's kind of some guidance on that.
Man, it just sounds very boring and uncomfortable. So what these researchers did is they studied physiological adaptations and performance outcomes. And I also love this about the study because we know that the physiological adaptations and biomarkers on that biochemical level don't always correlate perfectly well with performance outcomes. So it's important to look at both. So for the physiological adaptations, they looked at metabolomics, and that they did this by looking at muscle biopsy to get oxidation markers, any changes in those, and they also looked at urine. For performance outcomes, they looked at a 40K TT power output and a 40K TT time. They also looked at power at LT1 and LT2 and changes in the peak power output, as well as high intensity exercise capacity, which they measured as time to exhaustion at a continuous steady state of roughly 95% of the peak power output. All right. So what did they find? Well, let's look at the performance findings first. Pre and post training, both the polarized and the threshold groups saw significant improvements. So there was a significant improvement in the training interval power output, whether they were doing the threshold or the polarized intervals. They saw a significant increase in 40K TT power. So there's a significant increase in both. And there was no significant difference between the polarized and the threshold group. They saw an increase in high intensity exercise capacity for both, and it was significantly increased for both, but the polarized group actually increased that significantly more than threshold. And when I say significant, that's a statistical metric that's just saying that it's not likely that this is just due to chance.
So I want to say this.
Yeah.
Can I jump in here? This is very important to this outcome. So basically, they raised probably their VO2 max power with polarized statistically more than the threshold group. They raised their threshold more with the polarized group than the threshold group. But the 40K TT power was not significantly different, which is very interesting because you would think, well, how could that happen? And what probably happened is in the threshold group, that group doing mostly sweet spot, is they raised their ability to operate at a percentage of threshold for longer to get that same power, because the other group, polarized, actually raised their VO2 max and their threshold. So in order for this to work, that's what happened. Another thing in here that I'm kind of curious of why they put this in the study, and maybe there's a great reason, but they said that there was a significant difference in time for the 40K TT, but not in average power. And now they did their 40K TT on a CompuTrainer. So I know the way that works. It's an input of power and weight and all that sort of stuff. So if those other ones didn't change, the only input is power. And the only way to have a better outcome of a 40K time trial time is to pace better. But the power wasn't any different in the end. So just here, when you look at it, I think it stands to reason, based on this data, that if you don't have any Z3, you don't raise your threshold and your VO2 max as much as you did. The only two plans that we have that don't have Z3 would be the sweet spot based high volume 1 and 2. And again, that has a context. We're going to talk about that, but that's just how this study relates to what we have done.
Those
Amber,
poor
you
plans
go from
just
here?
get picked on. Yeah.
I know that they do.
No. All right. So let's look at what they found for the physiological markers too, because that's really interesting. They actually found that for neither group, for both groups, they saw no change in muscle oxidative markers, which is pretty interesting because we saw some significant changes in performance outcomes, but not the physiological adaptations. They did, however, see a significantly higher MCT4, which this is an important biomarker that has implications for lactate shuttling. It was significantly higher for both groups, and there was no significant difference between groups. They really weren't sure if this was from training stimulus or timing of biopsy, so we're not going to dig too far into that. They suggested in the paper that this might just be because these are well-trained athletes and maybe they can't improve the oxidative capacity, but I don't know, I'm a little dubious about that because a Cat 3 fitness level is very, very fit and very trained relative to somebody off the couch, but maybe not as trained relative to a professional level cyclist. So it's really hard to say, but the timing issue there may be part of what was going on. So let's look at some observations. And Nate already jumped into this a little bit, but based on the data presented, the authors concluded that the polarized approach was more effective. And that certainly seems to be true for some of the metrics that they looked at. The other thing that they said, and I'm going to quote from the paper here, the authors say, whereas we appreciate that trained athletes will incorporate all 3 intensity zones into their training schedules and competitions, our aim was to determine the impact of high-intensity interval work versus moderate-intensity continuous threshold training sessions on adaptation. So they know that all 3 are important, and then they say, since the absolute training volume at low-intensity zone 1 was closely matched between the groups, these differences in adaptation must come down to the training time spent in zone 2 or zone 3, with zone 3 proving more effective. Now, this is one of those moments where you don't have to be an expert in the field to just apply some simple logic. So they had one group that just did zone 1 and zone 2, and if we hold zone 1 equal, they were doing mostly zone 2. The other group was doing zone 1 and zone 3, holding zone 1 equal, they were doing just zone 3. So you could look at this as a comparison of zone 3 versus zone 2. That makes sense. So we can logically conclude that zone 2 only was not as effective as zone 3 only. But logical thing here, we can't rule out the scenario where no zone 3 was not as effective as some zone 3. Stated in a more positive way, some zone 3 is going to be way more effective than no zone 3, right? So we can't just conclude that zone 3 is better than zone 2 because we haven't ruled out that the zone 3 versus no zone 3 kind of logical conundrum here. So this is one of those moments where you definitely want to apply your own logic, because the authors themselves elsewhere in the paper state, and I quote, zone 3 is a critical component for promoting adaptation. So this is a really interesting, outstanding question. Not to say that the authors did a bad job or it's a poorly designed study. It's a really nicely designed study. It's quite elegant. But this is a really exciting, outstanding question that we can check out in future investigations.
Yeah, so I think it's great to know this too, that the zone 2 stuff did not raise the VO2 max as much as the zone 3 and the threshold. But again,
PPO.
relating... sorry, PPO. Yeah.
It's okay.
Sorry. All these words. Relating this stuff, though, back to TrainerRoad plans, the only two plans we have that are like this are the sweet spot base high volume. And it gets confusing of why, this plan is discussed so much when all of our plans besides those have Z3. We'll kind of get into that more later again. I'm kind of teasing later over and over again, but I just want to hit that a lot of times so that people understand that TrainerRoad is not a bunch of Z2 only training. We're a combination of Z2 and Z3 and a pyramidal approach for most of our plans.
And Nate already touched on this earlier, but since we're talking about our observations on the study, the interesting thing is that when the threshold group did not increase their peak power output, their high exercise capacity, as we saw, but that kind of indicates that for that 40K TT power output, where there was no difference between the group, that the threshold group was probably operating at a higher percentage of their capacity. So we're not seeing the performance outcomes across the board, but we do see that kind of hidden one that wasn't directly addressed. And this is really consistent with previous research, and it's actually consistent with our data at TrainerRoad too. This is what we would expect if someone were doing a similar training block.
That's actually the goal of sweet spot base high volume, is to get people to operate at a higher percentage of their threshold, and then later on in the base and build, order to raise their threshold through other means. Two, I misspoke earlier when I was talking about PPO performance. I called it VO2 max. It might have increased their VO2 max, but they did not measure that in here. And you can have power increase at VO2 max without raising your VO2 max. That's I just want to correct that for what I said.
Yeah, if in case you guys haven't noticed, we are deep in the weeds here, folks. We are deep. All right. So one other thing I want to mention about this experimental design, like I said, I really love this. The randomized crossover, it's very elegant. But there's a couple of points in here that didn't get brought up in the paper that I find really interesting. Again, taking that one step further, not just reading and taking it at face value, but let's think really critically about this. So the authors closely matched zone 1 volume between the groups. So we'll just say zone 1 volume is pretty much equal. Then that meant that they had to, the threshold group was focused on the moderate intensity, and then the polarized group was focused on the high intensity. So what ended up happening as a result of that is, in trying to keep the zone 1 match, the total volume and training load was significantly higher for the threshold group. Now, what the authors say is, notably, this outcome, the fact that they saw greater adaptations over 6 weeks in polarized than threshold, occurs despite a greater total training volume with the threshold training model, and occurs in already well-trained cyclists. So they're saying they're surprised that they didn't see more performance improvement outcomes in the threshold model since they were training more. Well, let's look at those numbers really quick. So keep in mind that the subjects have roughly a Cat 3 level of fitness, typical Cat 3 level of fitness. The polarized group was doing a TSS roughly of about 430 to 610 per week. Now, that's a pretty typical range for a Cat 3 cyclist, a highly trained Cat 3 cyclist. In the threshold group, they were doing between 515 to 750 per week. That's a big difference over 6 weeks. That's more of a Cat 1-2 elite level of weekly TSS. So there's a huge difference, very significant difference in training load and volume. And the authors actually looked at this statistically. There's a statistical significant difference between the volume and training load of the two groups. Now, what the authors assume is that doing a higher volume and higher training load would lead to greater adaptations, but we know logically that total workload, thinking in terms of KJs, for example, can lead to fatigue too. And that with recovery following a fatiguing block, you might see a supercompensation. So it's possible, and we don't know this. We don't know because it wasn't investigated in the study, but this is a cool, outstanding question to be investigated. What we don't know is there is a possibility that that greater training load led to greater fatigue, which meant that the threshold group was testing in a more fatigued state than the polarized group. And this is supported by some of the metabolomics. They did detect some stress markers in the threshold training group and not in the polarized group. So this would be a really interesting question to drill down on later. So the outstanding question here is, if there were some rest before the testing, would that have changed the outcome? Would there have been as big of a difference between the two groups? Who knows? We don't know.
Wait, that point you just said is super important, is that when they did these, they did not have any recovery week. They did the volume and tested right after that.
Right.
So the group that did the higher stress did not have a week of recovery. They just did higher stress and then tested right at the end of their block. And same thing with the other group with Polarized. They did their block and then right at the end of the block they tested rather than having recovery. And then after that, that's when they had the 4 weeks of low training. And this is where Amber said that possibly, we don't know, there could be some supercompensation happening in that group. Then you switch to another training method and the changes, they could be different. That's what I think. Right. That's the interesting point, is they did not rest before they retested. So the group that had the more testing, to me, would be more fatigued going into a test.
Right. Yeah. And it's interesting that the authors looked at that like, oh, more load would mean better adaptation, but we know that you need the rest between the load, because remember the equation, stress plus rest is adaptation. So that's a really interesting question. The other thing that is very related to that is there the possibility of an order effect here. And this is a little bit mitigated by the fact that they had the 4 weeks of detraining before crossing over. But if you think about it, one group started out as threshold, which had that much, much higher workload. Then they rested for 4 weeks. And then they did polarized, which was a lower workload with higher intensity. That's kind of almost the structure of a taper. Granted, it would be a long one. And 4 weeks rest is quite a bit. But that seems like it would end up in a very different place than if you started with polarized in a very low workload, rested, and then moved into a much, much higher workload. And that higher workload is not just higher than what you would have done in the polarized group, but at that level of fitness, that higher level of workload is, like I said, that's more of a Cat 1-2 elite level of workload for somebody who's at a Cat 3 level fitness. So that question of difference in workload is one, but then that also begs the question, is there an order effect? So would we have seen a different outcome if we had having that overload and then recovery, would that have ended up doing something different? And that's more a question of the periodization and how the training intensity distribution falls into a broader periodization model.
And so we don't know the answers to those questions because the data wasn't, that was not shown in the data inside the study. But a little side note here is this is how we organize our plans. And we get the question a lot of, why does specialty have less TSS than build or base? And we're going after this exact thing where as you get into specialty, we reduce the volume, we increase the intensity, and then as you get closer, there's even to your A event, a rapid reduction, or rapid reduction in volume, and we keep the intensity high, and then that peaks you for this event. So another interesting, as Amber said, these are interesting things. We still think it's a good study, but these are great questions that then be studied later in future studies to see if these things had any impact on it.
Right. And we're just applying all the tools that we talked about earlier and trying to analyze these studies, not just read them at face value, but really dig in and think about them. And we're spending a little bit of extra time on this study because it is one of the few specifically on cycling. So don't worry, we're not going to go this deep on every single one. But this is really, really interesting stuff. And one more thing I want to say about the study, because this is something that will come up in the other studies we talk about too, is all of the data in this study was shown in terms of averages. So they were looking at the mean plus or minus the standard deviation for the polarized group would be an N of six subjects. They looked at the mean and standard deviation. Same for the threshold group. And technically speaking, when you're looking at literature and you're doing statistical analysis, you should only ever display the data exclusively in terms of mean and standard deviation when the raw data, the individual data points, result in a normal distribution, or what you would normally think of as a bell curve. And having a normal distribution or a bell curve, when you only have 6 subjects where we know that there's high individual variability because that's just the nature of physiology, it's really, really unlikely that you're going to get a bell curve with just 6 subjects. So it would be really interesting to see the raw data. And when you only have an N of 6 or an N of 12, that's a pretty easy thing to display and show and talk about in a paper, because we know that even one outlier in a group of 6 can really drag the mean up or down and affect statistical significance. I'm not saying that that's what happened here, but as a reader of this study, it would be super interesting to be able to see how this broke down on an individual level, and it wouldn't be too hard when you have such a small N.
Yeah. So again, these are just kind of questions. It doesn't invalidate the study at all.
No,
it's just
study.
interesting. And this is to a demonstration of what we go through when we go through deep dives about how we read these studies.
Yeah.
Okay. So the takeaways. One, I think, let's say all the caveats we talked about aren't a big deal. And we can take away that Polarized is more effective across a range of performance metrics versus threshold training. That's at Z2, somewhere between 80% and 100% FTP when you have 0 Z3. So we also know too that the threshold only group was able to operate at a higher percentage capacity than Polarized, because Polarized raised their PPO and their threshold, but they had the same 40K average power. Mm-hmm. So with this stands, the next thing in our investigation would be, well, Z3 is important, but how important is it? Right. And also there's the one question about the questions on fatigue in there, but we can't really figure that out with any of the studies that we have on here. Okay, so now let's look at a study in runners. This is a Munoz, can't say his name right, can't talk, 2014 study that says, does polarized training improve performance in recreational runners? And this is the line here in the abstract is, runners who run the most polarized see the greatest improvement. But I think if we dive in the study a bit, it's less clear than that. Amber, can you take this away?
The central aim of this study was to quantify the impact of training intensity distribution on 10K performance in recreational athletes. So the researchers chose 30 recreational runners, again, deciding on the level of training. All of these folks did 8 weeks of common prep. So this was just to establish a nice clean baseline across all of the participants in the study. Then they did a 10K race to establish a performance baseline in the 10K, after which everybody did 10 weeks of training, and they split the group into 2. So you either did polarized training for those 10 weeks or threshold training for those 10 weeks. Now, the prescriptions for the distribution in each of these groups was a little bit different than what they actually did. So what they actually did was, in the polarized group, it was about 73% zone 1, 14% zone 2, 13% zone 3. For the threshold group, it turned out to be about 78% or 47% zone 1, 37% zone 2, and 16% zone 3. After they did that 10 weeks in that training intensity distribution, they did another 10K race, and they measured the difference between the pre-training and the post-training 10K race to look at the different performance outcomes. What they found was there was actually no statistical difference between the polarized group and the threshold training group. Aha, but there's a catch. After whittling that group of 30 down to an N of 6, they found a statistical difference. And the way that they did that was they looked at the athletes who had the most polarized training intensity distribution in terms of their actual training, and the most or least polarized, most threshold adhering training intensity distribution for the threshold athletes. So what those athletes did, the polarized group went from 73% zone 1 to 78% zone 1, 14% zone 2 to 11% zone 2, and 13% zone 3 to 11% zone 3. So essentially, they decreased the percentage of time that they spent in zone 2 and zone 3. Their zone 2 actually equaled zone 3, and they spent most of the time in zone 1. The other athletes in the threshold group that were part of this significant difference went from 47% zone 1 to 32% zone 1, so a big decrease in zone 1. They went from 30% zone 2 to 53% zone 2, so a huge
37.
increase in zone 2. Yeah, 37% zone 2. They went from 37% to 53%, and then the zone 3 actually stayed the same. So what we see here actually is the most polarized group. Really what just happened was they reduced the zone 3 and the zone 2 and zone 3 time, and they increased their time in zone 1. And the zone 2 and zone 3 were equal, which kind of is a good example of how the definition of polarized in the literature is pretty flexible, and it really changes a lot from study to study and even within a study. So what's interesting about this?
Sorry.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
I was going to say that we're probably going to say the same thing, that most polarized in this context, you read the abstract, you're like, most polarized, that must mean they must be like 80-20 or something like that. They were actually Z2 and Z3 matched. They had the exact same. And then the N is pretty low at 6 people out of 30. And then they really changed that other threshold group. And in this study, when they say threshold, they did include Z3 work. So that's just something to think about, is that in this group, when they did those distributions for runners, in runners, there could be impact. There's other things in running with being a load-bearing sport that could be adding to this, but Z2 and Z3 were the same, and that added a statistical difference in faster 10K race outcomes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So should we check out this study on the Ironman?
Let's do it. Okay. So this next one, this is Munoz, again, the same author. Training intensity distribution during an Ironman season, relationship with competition performance. So this is a N equals 9. They started with 13, but 4 dropped out. All athletes completed similar training, adjusted for fitness and training status. Researchers calculated time and zone, again, time and zone, not days, and looked at correlation with race times. And what did they find? They found that the more Z2 time that they did in cycling led to slower race outcomes, even though most of their race was completed in Z2. So this is interesting. This is for these half Ironman athletes of 9 people. If they did more Z2, so more of that between 80 and 100%, they had lower race outcomes.
So I just want to make a quick distinction. You said half Ironman just a second ago, and I want to clarify, this was actually looking at Ironman competition. And the reason I'm clarifying that is we're about to look at a study on half Ironman. But I want to clarify really quickly that these authors didn't manipulate the training intensity distribution for this. They were just observing the athletes training in the buildup for their Ironman competition. And then what they did was they correlated the time spent in each zone in that buildup, and they correlated the time in zone with performance outcomes in the actual race, which is a really cool way of doing this. Because one of the hard things about these physiological studies is asking athletes to purposefully totally switch up their training program for a pretty long period of time. So this was a pretty elegant way of looking at this. And again, their key finding was that the more zone 2 they did in cycling, the slower the race outcomes. But this is actually a very different result from a study that we're about to look at that's investigating training intensity distribution in half Ironman athletes.
So this one is called Polarized and Pyramidal Training Intensity Distribution, Relationship with a Half Ironman Distance Triathlon Competition. And this is Sells Perez et al. Of 2019. And the central aim, go ahead. Just take
this is a really, really recent study. Yep.
The central aim was to relate time training intensity distribution with performance during a half Ironman for polarized versus pyramidal training.
So in this study, they looked at 18 recreational male triathletes. Again, the authors had to decide whether they were going to do trained, untrained, elite, recreational. They chose recreational, and they defined recreational as athletes who had less than 2 years of experience previously with triathlon training. And what they did was they had the polarized versus pyramidal group. Now, keep in mind, recall that the polarized and pyramidal methods of training intensity distribution are the 2 types of training intensity distribution that target multiple zones. So these are pretty similar. So the treatment had a polarized group that was doing 85% of their training in zone 1, 4% in zone 2, and 11% in zone 3. The pyramidal group was doing 78% in zone 1, 19% in zone 2, and 3% in zone 3. And again, these authors were calculating these percents based on time in zone, not based on days. So these athletes trained for 7 weeks. 7 of those were generic, so matched between groups, again, to kind of get everybody on the same even playing field before they look at the polarized versus pyramidal. Then they did 13 weeks of specialized training in each of those training intensity distributions, polarized versus pyramidal. They kept the volume and the training load the same for both groups, so not a confounding factor here. Zone 1 was roughly pretty equal between the groups, so getting rid of another confounding factor. They both included some zone 3, so these were all limitations that, if you recall, we noted in the Neal paper earlier on. And importantly, because it's triathlon, they devoted the same percent of time to each discipline. So the polarized versus pyramidal group, they weren't spending more time on swimming, cycling, or running. They were evenly distributing the training time between those disciplines. The only difference in the training between the two groups was the polarization index. Now, we mentioned that these authors are using time and zone to determine the polarization, and this paper in particular used that polarization index that we used when we looked at all of the TrainerRoad training plans earlier. And the goal of the training, obviously, was a half Ironman. They took physiological measurements and performance measurements to look at, again, the physiological adaptations, and the performance outcomes were obviously just to do with the race times in the half Ironman. What they found was that the polarized and the pyramidal improved across the board, but there was no significant difference between polarized versus pyramidal. So both groups improved significantly, but there was no real difference between them. And in fact, training time in zone 2 correlated with better performance in the recreational triathlete. So this is exactly opposite of what we saw in that Munoz study for the Ironman. And this is why it's important to read more than one study when you get into the literature and to really think critically about how they all compare. So the authors here conclude that moderate intensity, that LT1 to LT2 zone, is relevant and it should not be ruled out for long distance triathlons, and that zone 2 might be more important for athletes with less training experience. So again, this is one of those big outstanding questions in all of this, which is, how does training status affect how well a training intensity distribution is going to impact performance outcomes?
So far, kind of what we've seen is if you have pyramidal and polarized, the research suggests that they're pretty equal in terms of race outcome. It's interesting too, is a point on this about different populations, different intensity, training intensity distributions have different outcomes based on recreational versus not. And that is super interesting for us, especially with adaptive training, is how do you figure out these nuances of where you are in your training history about what will then make you the fastest cyclist, or in this term, triathlete, inside of your whole life context. And again, this is why this is so cool. These things they always raise more questions than they answer. But hopefully there's a way that we can speed up this learning in the future. Okay, so now let's look at a meta-analysis.
Right. Okay. So we've seen there's conflicting evidence in the literature. We've seen there are different ways and flexible ways of defining what a polarized training intensity distribution is. So it's kind of a mess out here. There's some really promising trends. Obviously, polarized is a very promising training intensity distribution, but looking at a meta-analysis kind of helps us evaluate the literature in a more quantitative way. So Rosenblatt et al. Did this meta-analysis called Polarized versus Threshold Training Intensity Distribution on Endurance Sport Performance in a Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis Randomized Controlled Trials. So when you do a meta-analysis or a systematic review, generally what you do is you set out some criteria with which studies that you are going to include need to meet those certain criteria in order to be included, because you can't be comparing apples to apples or apples to oranges. So what you're trying to do is get as close to comparing apples to apples as you can. But as we've seen, the studies in the literature can be really, really different. So you have to find some way of defining what an apple is in order to make those comparisons in a meta-analysis. So in this meta-analysis, they looked at hundreds of papers, and out of those, only 4 studies total qualified and met all the criteria for the systematic review, and only 3 of those studies actually qualified for the meta-analysis. Now, the meta-analysis is the part where they actually do the quantified analysis. So the 4 studies total, the Neal study is in there again. Of course, that's the first one we covered that had no zone 3 and had a few other shortcomings, but was really, really interesting, especially because it's a cycling related and cycling specific study. The Munoz study on the recreational runners was also included in there. And only 2 of the studies that were included in this were specific to cycling, and both of those studies had 0 zone 3 work. So the big takeaway from this one really is the fact that you could only find 4 studies total to include in the review and only 3 to include in the meta-analysis. In most other fields, if you got to that point, you would decide not to publish the paper. And not to say that this is not a valuable contribution. It certainly is. But what it does is it illustrates that there is a major scarcity of research in the literature right now, especially research that's consistent in methodology, that's consistent in the training status of the subjects, that's consistent in the definition even of what the polarized training intensity distribution is within the study. So it's there's just not a lot out there yet, which is exciting for us because this is a whole train of research that we get to follow and discover, and it's really exciting for the scientists because this is job security.
Yeah. So I just want to get a point that you said that's pretty important because this meta is used to criticize TrainerRoad. Is one, it's using 2 studies that already use TrainerRoad to say like, oh, there's this vast research, but for the ones that are cycling only, there's no Z3 work, which TrainerRoad, besides for sweet spot based high volume 1 and 2, we do Z3 work. We follow more of the pyramidal approach. And I probably have to say that like 3 more times because I see it on the internet all the time. And I want to make sure that we don't get branded in that way, that we are just Z2 work all the time, base build specialty, Z2 work, and that's what we are. Okay, so now let's go into the next study. Hydron, current scientific evidence for a polarized cardiovascular endurance training model.
This is a really nice review paper, and it does a nice review of sampling the current literature out there, and they're looking at multiple disciplines across multiple studies. I'm not going to go super deep on this one just for the sake of time, but I will share a direct quote from the paper in terms of one of the things that the authors concluded, which was despite only a handful of reported studies on polarized training model, so again, there's still a scarcity of research, this research is still emerging, and a limited understanding of the key physiological changes. This is one of the key outstanding questions in all of this, is there's still not agreement on what are the best data to evaluate the effectiveness of certain training intensity distributions. Outstanding question. So despite only a handful of reported studies on polarized training models and a limited understanding of the key physiological changes, the polarized training model is promising for cardiovascular and muscular endurance exercise prescription. Absolutely. And that's one of the things that we're seeing consistently in these studies is the polarized training intensity distribution is definitely promising and it's definitely showing a lot of efficacy. But to say that it's optimal when we have there's still so much conflicting evidence and there's just not that much research yet. We can't get there just yet.
Yeah, and this is why we're adding polarized plans to TrainerRoad to figure out what is optimal, not just for everybody as a blanket, but for you individually at what time of year, for what your goals are and all that sort of stuff. Okay,
right.
Next,
and,
go ahead.
Oh, I just want to make one point on that. We're doing this as an experimental plan. So we're not going to just throw a new plan into our training system when we don't know enough about how effective it is. But we do understand that some of our athletes really like to experiment on themselves and see if something different might work. So we want to give them the opportunity to self-experiment and see how this goes. And in the process of doing that, we'll get this valuable data that we'll be able to see and start answering some of these questions.
Great. So let's now go on to the next one. This is Seiler 2007. Autonomic recovery after exercise in trained athletes. And this paper has been used to criticize TrainerRoad for intensity distribution inside of a plan. Now, this is a super interesting paper. What Seiler was doing was measuring how long HRV, heart rate variability, takes to return to baseline after workout. So what HRV is that is measuring the time between the beats of your heart rate and then how variable that is. So something that has a low variability would be like marching band, right? It's like boop, boop, boop. Something with a high variability would be you're kind of off the beat. It changes a lot. And what Seiler was showing in this paper is you have a baseline of higher variability, and then they work out that variability goes lower. And then how long does it take to return to the previous baseline? Yes, Amber.
It's only the two of us, but I'm still going to raise my hand. So one thing that's important to note here is what HRV actually measures. It's not just the variability in your heart rate, but the variability in your heart rate is a proxy for understanding how well in balance your autonomic nervous system is. So how well balanced are your sympathetic and your parasympathetic systems. So the more stressed you are, that's going to change your heart rate variability. And the more recovered you are, theoretically, that will also change your heart rate variability. I just wanted to make that clear. So it's not just a difference in how variable it is, but why that's a proxy for recovery specifically.
Yeah, and this is something we've mentioned the last time in the podcast is we'd like to pull in HRV and then try to have ML correlate it between different performance and qualitative measures that you put into the system. Because this is kind of like polarized. There's debate about when you should take HRV in the middle of the night or in the morning, and how you then should use that. It's not 100%. This is the way to do it. So what Seiler found that in this study is that for elite athletes, both the Z2 or Z3 work took about 30 minutes to get back. I'm sorry, not elite, highly trained athletes. These are highly trained runners, about 15 hours per week. And so a Z2 workout and a Z3 workout, it both took 30 minutes to get back to that baseline. But in less trained, it was about 90 minutes. And this is super interesting. This has no context into training intensity in the plan and recovery long term. This is just talking about this specific HRV when it returns to baseline. And although that doesn't mean that there's not a correlation between this, and I was thinking about this, if we could get our athletes to do it, but I highly doubt we could get recreational athletes to sit in a chair for 90 minutes after every workout and see how long it takes to get back to it. That's kind of the stuff that in the lab it might be good, but out of lab it not be good to try to measure that HRV. But we've got some other ideas, and as they get into the system, we will totally announce it and let you know. Anything else on this one?
No, let's do it.
Okay, next one, Larson, 2010. Training for intense exercise performance, high intensity or high volume. What Larson says is if training does not have a blend of both high intensity and high volume, high volume training inserts into the program, performance ability can stagnate. Absolutely. This is another one that's used to criticize TrainerRoad, but we absolutely agree with this, that at some point, if you don't have high volume and some intensity, you're going to stagnate. And actually, I think we all know this, but everyone's going to stagnate at some point. You can't just get there with only volume or only intensity. It's a blend between both. Now, the question is that we want to figure out is how much intensity and how much volume. This is the key, like we keep going out, right? What is the distribution for you? And also this distribution of small intensity and volume, is it different between someone who's doing 20 hours per week and someone doing 3.5 hours per week? And this is another reason why we're going to have these polarized plans where we'll keep that distribution steady at that low 3.5 hours a week and see what happens.
Yeah. And just a quick note, I'm no spring chicken. In my very, very early exercise physiology class, this was the classic question that was being posed as the eternal question of intensity versus volume. And this is a question that has really been a wonderful point of exploration in the science for a really, really long time. And there's a good reason for it. Biology is complicated, but it's really cool and it's really fun. We get to dive in and learn more.
Okay, next one. Seiler 2010. What is the best practice for training intensity and duration, distribution, in endurance athletes? And so what this study was, it was a description of what elite athletes do. And this is the key line. For an athlete training 10 to 14 times per week, this means that 2 to 3 of these sessions would be threshold or high intensity training bouts. And then at elites with this volume, more high intensity training does not make them any faster and might overtrain them. So this is super interesting too. What Seiler saw is that 10 to 14 times per week. I bet you there's not a single person listening to this that trains 10 to 14 times per week, but this is because we're cycling, and that's not normal in cycling, but this is a ton. And if in that context of 10 to 14 times per week, you can only handle 2 to 3 intense sessions. If you do another session and keep all those other volume sessions, it tends to overtrain someone. Now, the question is, if let's say you have these elite people and they're training 4 times per week, what if they did 11 less sessions and added 1 sweet spot session? Would this ratio still hold true? Stands to reason that it would not. Like, you would be able to drop 11 sessions and have 1 sweet spot station. But again, we'll look at this and see if this carries to lower volumes, if not. So that's one of these. Again, you have to think of it in context. If they're training 14 times per week, they can't do more than 3 sessions. But if you're training 4 times per week, can you do 4 sessions? Especially if not all sessions have the same recovery, if you're doing a little less. And we're going to cover that in a little bit.
Right. And then it's not just can you, but should you? And so there's so many questions we still have yet to answer. It's going to be awesome.
Exactly. Okay, this last one.
Right. So this was a systematic review by Keneally et al. The effect of periodization and training intensity distribution on middle and long distance running performance. Now, we've already brought up the question of like how well can we translate results from one discipline to another? Still an outstanding question. This one we're not going to spend too much time on just for the sake of time, but feel free to read it yourself. But the main takeaway from this review, and again, it's a review, so they were going through all of the studies that they could find in the literature that aligned with a particular set of criteria. So they were looking exclusively at runners. But what they found was a pyramidal and a polarized training intensity distribution approach. Both of those were superior to threshold training, which is the training intensity distribution approach. So threshold training is being used here as the training intensity distribution, and that's the one that focuses focuses primarily on zone 2, whereas pyramidal and polarized are those training intensity distributions that focus on multiple zones. So in this case, what he found in the literature on running was that pyramidal and polarized were superior to threshold training, but there was no distinction between pyramidal and polarized.
So, okay, we've gone through all the studies now, and hopefully you're not all asleep. Some people, it's like the next day, they're like rewinding. So what can we fairly conclude from the research? Like, should I be changing all of our plans, right? Like right now?
Right. And this is the question that you want to ask yourself every time you read a study and every time you read multiple studies, given all of the limitations and the caveats and the confounding factors, what can we fairly conclude? So here's what I think that we can conclude from what we've just talked about. Polarized can be effective, absolutely, but we can't responsibly conclude that it is optimal. The research is still really unclear on many things. So one of the things we mentioned, what data are the best foundation for quantifying effectiveness of different training intensity distributions? Because every study was looking at different data to quantify performance outcomes or physiological adaptations, and we still don't know what's the best metric. There are other possible training intensity distribution models out there. There are only 5 major ones that we see in the literature, but you can imagine that there's a lot of ways to move these levers around and create other intensity distributions that have not been investigated. We'd like to see the effect of training intensity distribution in combination with different periodization models. Remember that training intensity distribution is at this very granular level, and it exists within the larger periodization of an entire training plan. So that's another outstanding question. What about the effect of novelty? So if an athlete is switching from one long-term stressor, like if they've been doing threshold model training intensity distribution forever, and then they decide suddenly to switch to polarized, is the novelty of that switch in stress, is that enough to elicit some new positive adaptations? What's the best way to periodize a training intensity distribution over longer time horizons? Because long-term effects have yet to be investigated. Do different disciplines benefit from different training intensity distributions? One of the things that's been noted that we haven't mentioned yet in the literature is, especially for disciplines that have high eccentric forces or high force impacts that sustain a lot of muscle damage, like running, would those be different and benefit from different training intensity distributions than, say, a low impact sport like cycling or swimming or rowing? So sport, training status, goals, timing, all of these things are things that can play into why or how effective a training intensity distribution is for somebody. And so these aren't just questions that we raised today out of thin air. These are questions that other researchers have pointed out as really exciting avenues for potential future research. We'd like to direct you to a really nice review by Stogel et al. In 2015 that raises a lot of these questions as well.
If you like this video, make sure you give us a thumbs up.
If you didn't like this video, you can give it a thumbs down, but let us know what you would have done differently in the comments below.
If you want to see more of these videos, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel. And if you want to become a faster cyclist, check out TrainerRoad.com.
Do it.
If you think I have better hair than Jonathan, give it a thumbs up. If not, leave a comment.
My hair is better than his.